This is the Sony A7S3, and today I'll be reviewing this camera from a stills photographer point of view. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions. I'm a portrait photographer that occasionally dabbles myself into other forms of videography or photography. So the A7S3 for me was purchased mainly for its high frames rate video functions, but today I'll be reviewing it from a stills photographer point of view, especially for portraiture. So before I start, let's take a look at some of the photos I shot with this camera itself, and I would say as in the field, this camera works out pretty well if you ask me. Now 12 megapixel will just mean that it is a smaller photo, but the quality of the pixels are really good. It is really sharp and you can easily zoom in 100% or even 150% and utilize those photos. So I was never restricted by the megapixels itself. And in fact, in the modern world, if you consume your information mainly on the web or in small printed material such as magazines or even A3 photos, the 12 megapixel sensor is more than competent enough. So let's take a look at the A7S3 and let's review this camera and let's talk about it. How does it perform, especially in terms of dynamic range and image quality for the purpose of stills photography. Now, the first part I will talk about is the body itself. This body is 700 grams. It is a nice and well-built body. Sony has refined this build over the time. I just didn't like the edges still, but other than that, everything else is quite round off and nice to hold. Now, my only issue in terms of its mechanical exterior construction is that the grip. The grip for my hand, which is not very big, it just feels that sometimes my little finger is left out. So this grip could have been bumped out a little bit more, or the notch here can be slightly higher, and it will probably solve the problem. Because with my R5, I don't suffer the same issue, while the A7S3 do let me dangle my little pinky. In terms of buttons and controls, there are tons of it. 2 buttons on top, and then there are 4 dials with together on-off switch and the main shutter button. And then there are tons of them behind. You can almost configure the camera in any way you want. And I will tell you honestly, this camera has more configuration capability than my GFX 100. That's my feeling. Because even the 4-way dial here is actually configurable. So I do get a lot more custom buttons on this A7S3. Now, there is no buttons in front, but almost every other camera with buttons in front, I rarely use them because it just doesn't feel intuitive to press the buttons at the front with my fingers itself. So I'm glad there's no button there. Now, this camera has a mode dial and an exposure compensation dial. Every other dial is configurable except these 2. Maybe I'm not too sure about exposure compensation, so if I'm wrong, do correct me. But one of the interesting things is the Sony actually designed this dial differently. For the exposure compensation dial, you can hear it. Is an activate and deactivate dial where it will allow you to turn or lock it, right? While for the mode dial, on the other hand, is press and hold to turn. So there's 2 different mechanical movements, and this can be confusing in the field because you'll be wondering why one dial can turn and the other dial can't, and vice versa. So they could have done the same for both of these dials to just be more consistent itself. Now the mode dial is a standard PASM, then video mode, and then all the other custom mode. So the mode dial is very traditional. Personally, I prefer the dial over the LCD and pressing multiple buttons, but I do appreciate the LCD because it allows me to see all the settings on the top from the camera if you're looking at the R5 or the EOS R. Sony never had that, so I think Sony users will not see any difference when they come to the A7S3. But as a Canon user, I do say that I miss the part of seeing my settings on the top of my camera itself. Now that is of course for the dials and camera. Let's look at the doors themselves. And firstly, there is one door for the battery, and secondly, there's another door for the SD card. So for SD card standard, they use the standard SD cards together with CF Express A. The nice thing of Sony is that both of the slots use the same cards, so you can have double CF Express A or double SD cards, or one SD card, one CF Express A, up to you to configure yourself. And with the SD card, I would say as you can shoot most of the frame rate except OI with just a V60 card, which is very convenient. I mean, I have recently shot a lot of slow-mo clips with this simple and affordable SD card media. So that's one thing to note. Now, the battery is from the bottom here, but the interesting is how they align. So normally I would have aligned it like this, facing upwards, and then push in the camera. But this camera is the opposite. I align it, face it downwards, and then push the camera in. I mean, this is a minor quirk, and I don't think even it's a quirk. As long as you use Sony cameras, you probably get used to it. Now, the only other thing that I want to comment about the doors is that, firstly, this door here has a latch. Both doors have latches, in fact. So this door's latch is automatic. So once you push down, the spring will actually lock it, so you do not accidentally pull it up. But for the battery door, however, you have to push it down and use a deliberate action to lock it up. Why is that required? I do not know. Why can't they make it an automatic, spring latch so that you press down, it automatically locks up? Because this is an extra step you must remember every time you slot the battery in. Okay. And the next thing I want to talk about is the slots at the side. So there's nothing exciting about the slots at the side except for one. It uses a full HDMI slot, and this slot is a lot more durable. And the cables are also a lot more durable. As such, you don't worry about breakage that much. And lastly, I'll talk about the EVF and the LCD. Now, the EVF is really huge, but as I said in my previous review, you must put your eye in the center. If you move your eyes slightly to the left and right of the EVF, it just feels slightly blurred. By the way, this EVF is fantastic. 9 million pixels. If you are looking it from the center, it is a very immersive experience. But shift it off axis a little bit, and it doesn't feel as sharp. Yeah, but this is something that can get used, because if you just slam the EVF to your eye when you use out in the field, which is probably how you do it, you will not even think too much and just put it there, it looks okay most of the time. Now, the other thing is the LCD panel here. This LCD is a standard panel, not ultra high resolution or low resolution. But the only issue that concerned me when I was using this camera is because in bright daylight, especially in Singapore, during the sunny season, which is almost 300 days a year, I can't see what's on the screen because this screen is not as bright as my iPhone. So there's something to note. So if you are shooting outdoors, you may want to have a screen like this, which is like a 3000 nit screen, so that you can actually see what you are shooting. But if not, just know that this LCD is just not bright enough, at least for me. Or you can use a hood or sunshade to just block it out. Okay, so that's so much it for the physical dimension. Let's talk about its handling in the field, and then of course its image stabilization and autofocus. Now in terms of handling, as I said earlier, the pinky will just hang off. So when I hold this camera, I don't feel as stable as the R5, especially if I hold a heavier lens. In fact, I did try holding a reflector with this lens. It just doesn't work out very well. On my R5, I can hold it a little bit longer. On the A7S3, not so long. It just feels less stable to me. Maybe it's because, look at the handle, there's this slant out which have a tendency to just slide off. So if they slant the other way, it would have been better, or if not, just have a straight one, it would be slightly better. I mean, they are trying to wrap around your finger, but it creates a bit of, I'll just say it creates a bit of slipperiness here. So the next we'll talk about image stabilization. I did the test before. The flag shots you see in this photo are the A7S3, and the not flag shots are the R5. And 5-star means perfectly tech sharp, while 1-star means unusable. 3-star means barely usable if I really want to. Now, the A7S3, at least with the Sigma 135mm, scored a decent score. I would say as the number of 5-star shots are lesser than the R5. The R5 is a better image stabilized camera than the A7S3. And I tested it a few times, and that's the common result. The R5 usually is slightly ahead of the A7S3 when it comes to results. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It really depends. I mean, unless you are really, really into low light, want to shoot at 120, 110, and 1.5 of a shutter, then yes, the Canon R5 is actually a slightly better camera. But it's just really slight. I guess it's like half a stop advantage in terms of that low light shooting. But for the purpose of portraiture, you really don't go below 120 anyway. 120 and below, you get more movement from the subject itself than the camera. So that's something to worry, in another way. So the whole purpose of image stabilization to me is to ensure that when I shoot at normal shutter speed, like 1 focal length or half a focal length, I still get relatively sharp and usable shots. And I think the A7S3 will deliver that function. But the R5 is still a better camera when it comes to image stabilization, if that is what that matters to you. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is autofocus. And I didn't do a very extensive test. I didn't have that much time. But I would say as outdoors-wise, I did 300 over photos over the last week. And I would say as the amount of soft shots due to autofocus issues is less than one hand count. And the rest of the shot that were not focused is because my focus point was not on the subject itself for whatever reasons. And when it comes to fast-moving subject like this shot here, actually what happens is that you can see that she's frozen in motion, but she's technically swinging the sword because the sword is a two-handed sword, and she keeps saying that the character uses two hands to swing normally, but sometimes when she do her pose, it's one hand. So we tried to do her pose with one hand with the sword. It's really heavy. She had to spin and hold the sword in mid-air. So for this particular shot, she swing tons and tons of time, but most of them were sharp. So this camera was very reliable for spinning motions where the subject head bobbles front and back a little bit while shifting around and the eyes appearing suddenly and disappearing suddenly. So this camera is quite reliable if you ask me. At least it's no less reliable than the Canon R5 in terms of spinning and moving shots. I think more testing is required to see whether running forward, running backward makes a difference, and any other modes makes a difference or not. The only other thing I noticed about the A7S3 is maybe because its resolution is a bit low. When the subject is further, it tends to lose the eye a little bit quicker than the R5. That is my initial opinion on this camera itself. But other than that, in most normal distance, this camera is very reliable for the purpose of face detection, eye detection, and autofocus. It is extremely accurate as long as the box appear for the eye, or if not, you move the spot to where you want, it is usually spot on. Now, let's talk about the last one, which is image quality. And image quality wise, I will not talk about pixel. As I said earlier, the 12 megapixel is okay to me, and if you are producing web content, it's more than enough. So let's talk about its dynamic range and then how it works out. So for dynamic range wise, it's about how much highlight you can recover and how much shadow you can recover. So let's first talk about highlight, because that is a lot lesser for modern cameras itself. So when this camera, you can set it up to have a Zebra 100+, which means that it will highlight any part of the photo that is 100% overexposed, at least when it comes to the preview itself. So once the preview shows it's overexposed, means after applying the gamma profile or whatever, it is white. In this case, normally the RAW still saves a bit of data, and the question is how much data does it store? So for this camera, I tried out. You can see in this particular shot, the sky is white, as you can see in my handphone photo. And then what I did was that I shoot something 2 stops higher, and then save the photo down, and then recover it 2 stops after, in Lightroom itself. And you can see that the sky looks the same. So a shot 2 stops overexposed will still be recoverable in post-process. So that is the highlight recovery of this camera, about 2 stops above 100% for Zebras itself. So it's quite okay. Now, in terms of shadow recovery, let's look back at the normally exposed sky photo, which is still very white. Let's look at the corner here. Now, this corner is really dark. If you ask me, there is no details at all. It looks like at least 4+ stops or even 5 stops underexposed. Let's push it 5 stops in post-process in Lightroom, and you can see all the details returned, be it the foliage, be it all the little details, and the amount of noise is quite little. At 200%, you will just see mainly slight luminance noise, and if you ask me, that's very acceptable. It also doesn't seem to have any magenta tinting, and doesn't seem to have any weird green tinting, because even though it's green foliage, if it has green tint, it looks like, I don't know, alien color, alien green. But yes, it doesn't seem to have any such effect. It looks very natural. So if you ask me, the 5 stops recovery was really good. And also notice that there is no weird colored chroma noise, which is very terrible if you ask me. Luminance noise are easy to correct, but chroma noise is problematic. So that's about it for the static test. Let's take a look at real-world photo shoot. So in this particular photo shoot with Ryuki, you can see a raw photo and a processed photo. Now, you can notice how I expose the shot. I'm exposing to the highlights, where the highlights are just nice 100+ overexposed. It means there's a blinker on the highlights itself. So you can take a look at this shot here. After post-processing, I recovered most of the important highlights except for the sleeve. It still looks overexposed. But I can tell you that if I was to push 2 stops under like I did in my sky shot, you will see that the sleeve details return. So it's actually maintaining all the highlight details, but it's up to me whether I want to recover or not. In this particular case, I want to keep it overexposed because it shows like the sun is shining very brightly on her. Now, let's look at the shadow, especially behind her ear, the hair. Now, notice that in the original shot, there's almost no details, but after pushing 1.5 stops of exposure and 80 stops of shadow recovery, you can see most of the details in the hair is recovered. And notice there is almost no noise there, neither is there any funny chroma or any color tinting. So I think the recovery is doing a very good job. Now look at the bottom right hand also, you notice that it's very dark in the original shot, but in the recovered shot, in fact I recover a bit more, notice there's so little noise and all the color details are still maintained properly. And you can also see all the bokeh there. So overall, if you ask me, from the stills photographer point of view, for the purpose of dynamic range, it does recover at least 4 stops very confidently and 2 stops in the highlight very confidently, without inducing any form of weird noise or chroma or color tinting. So if you ask me, that is a very respectable performance. By the way, the EOS R5, when you recover 5 stops, there is a slight tint, but at 4 stops, there is no tint. While the GFX 100 can recover 5 stops and have no issues with it. So if you ask me, the A7S3 seems to be quite on par with all the modern cameras I know out there. And so far I tried, there seems to be no sort of color tinting even at 5 stops recovery. So it may actually be slightly ahead of even the Canon R5 or the Sony A7R4 when it comes to 5 stop recovery, because those cameras have a slight magenta or green tint when they recover, and these cameras don't seem to exhibit it, which is very important for me in terms of color. And that's about it for image quality. I think the A7S3 in my first review here is a very competent camera. I just want to highlight a little bit of the video. So after I did the photo shoot with Ryuki, I actually did some slow motion video. So I shot like 20 over clips with 100 frames per second. In fact, I can show you one clip here. This will highlight one of the many clips I shoot during the shoot itself. And it was 32 degrees Celsius. It was really hot. And even after shooting 20 over clips, after a photo shoot of 1 over hour, the camera did not show any sign of overheating. It was really reliable and autofocus was spot on. As you can see, I zoom in, motion-wise, I was on a gimbal. I moved the camera in, rotate around her and pull out. In normal time, you notice that there is actually no loss of autofocus. The autofocus was spot on even in 100 frames per second. So a very impressive performance, and I really enjoyed using the A7S3 for the video itself. Now, this is not a full video review because I have not tested it comprehensively, but I can tell you that if you were to run it constantly non-stop in 100 frames per second, it lasts 26 minutes before shutting off, and then recovering 10 minutes will let you shoot another 40 minutes. So it is much more reliable when it comes to shooting high frame rates compared to the R5, which will easily overheat after 15 minutes. And then even in real world, when you use it, it actually counts the standard usage time together with the actual recording time, and it just overheats really easily with the R5. So the A7S3 is a lot more reliable. Now, in conclusion, is that the A7S3 is a fantastic hybrid camera. If you are doing 50% video, 50% photo, and most of your photos appear only for the purpose of web content, I think the A7S3 is a very good and competent camera, because it's really cool to see slow motion, because it's something we don't see normally. So the A7S3 is a great content creator's camera itself. Now, if you are doing a lot more photos and a lot less videos, you may want to consider the R5, because the R5 is actually good for burst videos. Or if not, if you're shooting mainly 30 frames per second, it's a better choice. And it costs about a few $100 more than this camera itself. Now, if you are mainly a video shooter and you still want a camera form factor, occasionally shoot thumbnails and photos, then the A7S3 is definitely the choice itself. Because in this case, the only alternative is A1 or FX3. Now, the A1 is not as overheat resistant as the A7S3 here, and the FX3 is even better, but it costs more, and it depends whether you need the XLR handle or not. If you don't need those handles, the A7S3 is better because it even has a viewfinder, which is a lot more useful as a photographer's tool. If you use the FX3, there's no viewfinder. In bright daylight, you can almost not shoot any photo itself because you can't see what's happening. Overall, I would say as the A7S3 is a worthy camera for a hybrid shooter, especially if you're producing web content. And if you have any questions on this camera, the Canon R5 or the GFX 100, do drop down in the comments below. But if not, I will see you in the next review, especially a follow-up of this camera or a follow-up of any other Sony lenses. Till then, I'll see you again. Bye-bye.